Hi, thank you. We have a lot to talk about, and that's both the good and the bad news. Uh-oh, I forgot part of my talk here. I have to go get it. But I can start by saying that my second grade teacher always told me that you have to hear something 2 or 3 times before you'll remember it. And so I'm really glad that Bob talked first, because he basically introduced a lot of what I want to talk about, and then really glad that Paul talked second, because he said a lot of it too. So this will be the 3rd time, and that means you have to remember everything I say, and there will be a quiz. So this talk was compiled from slides from a lot of different people, and so I thank them, and their names are at the bottom here. And so let us go. So what kinds of energy are we talking about? Pretty much all of them. There's the more traditional types that we often think about. There's the new technologies, the oil, shale, and tar sands, and then the alternative energies such as solar and wind. All of these, of course, are going to have impacts. They're all going to increase the human footprint in the West. And so what I want to talk about first is what kinds of things can we see coming down the pike, and then at the end talk about what we might do about them. So basically, if you look at the trends for solar energy, or I should say locations for solar energy, they're pretty much us. And wind has a very similar footprint to the solar patterns. And so, you know, when you think about solar and alternative energies, wind and that, you can think about pretty much the western United States. Oil shale, there's a lot for us. Here's this area here is a big, big bed of oil shale. And so again, if you're thinking about this region of the world, you're thinking about us. Here's the sage-grouse conservation area that you just saw from Bob's talk. Here's oil and gas leases. Here's geothermal. Here's wind corridors. And there's the proposed nuclear power plant at Green River, which is actually well on its way to permitting. So, you know, there's really a lot of thought about what's going to happen in the West, and that we have a ton of energy. And I would like to add, this isn't going to not happen. I mean, it's really important for us to recognize this. We're not going to stop it. Saying no isn't going to work. We really do, as you have heard from the previous 2 speakers, have to figure out how to do this in a smart way, because it's not going to go away. So if we zoom in a little bit, I thought this was worth realizing the density of oil wells that are already in the upper Colorado River watershed. We have 71,000 wells in this area already. Projections is that in 2011, that was the 71,000. By 2025, we're probably going to be at about 109,000 wells, and that line is only thought to be increasing over time. So it's probably going to be even more. And one thing that's really important to realize, and I will talk more about this, is that along with wells, of course, come roads and transmission lines and pipelines and things, and well pads and things like that, so that we're looking at about 22,000 of miles of roads in the upper Colorado River Basin alone, only due to oil field exploration and development. Not exploration, I'm sorry, development. So that's a lot. On top of that, we have to realize the paved road imprint that's already out there. So these are only roads that people drive 60 miles an hour or more on. And then we have to put on top of that, just in southeast Utah, we have, like just in this little corner here, we have 6,000 miles of unpaved, whether it be gravel or dirt roads. So we have this tremendous road footprint out there already before you overlay any sort of oil field development or, you know, whatever, solar or whatever you want to say. Here's an example of what an oil field can look like in terms of road development, and so you really intensify that road network. And of course, what I'm aiming at here is the word fragmentation that you heard from Bob. Energy exploration can also put in a lot of road via off-road vehicle activity that ORVs then continue to utilize. A lot of areas have been really nicely reclaimed, and successfully so, others not successfully so. So I don't want to imply that all of the seismic truck activity end up in roads. That's not true. But certainly some of them do. And a lot of areas are thumped again and again and again. And so it's not like the seismic trucks go through once and you never see them again. Around the Moab area, where I'm the most familiar, we have had up on the island in the sky literally dozens of thumpages happen in the last 30 years. And part of the issues here, and part of my solution, which is of course entirely impractical, is to have that information made available to the BLM so that they can say, you know guys, there's nothing here, and no, you're not going to thump it yet again. And then other areas, you know, leave it for, you know, thumpage. But it is an issue where we really just thump these areas over and over and over again. People, and these are often on 800-foot squares, so you got the lines running one way and the thumper trucks running this way on 800-foot grids. So you really crisscross an area. And they go straight. They run over the trees, they run over the shrubs, they run over the soil crust, and they can leave behind some pretty large swaths of not very nice looking landscape. The impacts basically from the loss of the soil crust, as you heard yesterday from Roger, that you're talking about a loss of soil fertility and stability. You get in corridors for invasive, you have increased dust off of these areas, which I will talk about later. You have, like I said, some of these roads are then used as ORV corridors. Aesthetics, these take a really long time to recover, and so they can be not necessarily eyeball candy for a really long time. So let's get to the fragmentation that Bob alluded to. Fragmentation really is a big deal, especially at the scale that we're probably looking at what's going to happen unless we manage to plan. And I have that same take-home message as our previous two speakers, is I really believe that this is not either or, that we really can have our cake and eat it too, but we've got to do landscape planning. And if we don't do it at a landscape scale, it's not going to work. And we're going to be just continue down the path we're down, and that's a lot of fragmented landscape. Lots of animals don't like roads, even dirt roads that are not used very often. Studies have shown that pronghorn don't like roads, even though they're not used very often, and commonly used roads, even though still dirt. You can see impacts on desert tortoises and pronghorn up to 4 kilometers away. So they're really sensitive to the presence of the road, not necessarily the traffic on the road. Dust, again, I bring in, this is dust not from the off-roads, but dust from the dirt roads and the gravel roads. I will talk more about the impacts, but they are local, i.e. to the plants right along the road, to regional, and that's how it affects fresh water supplies, and I will spend some time on that. Invasives like to come in along roads. There's been a bunch of studies shown that they love to come in along roads. There's lots of things that road fill bring in. There's also more moisture along the side of a road, and so then they often spread out into the landscape from there. That, of course, has all sorts of downstream impacts, from habitat loss to fire to all greater windstorms, frankly, and I mean dust produced off of landscapes that are annualized, and then in drought years they don't germinate, and so you have unprotected soil surfaces. There's all sorts of reasons we hate invasives, and we know that. Light. This is not a remote area. I couldn't find a picture on the web of lights in a remote area. But anyway, light can be a major source of pollution in remote areas. The animals out there are not used to them, and they key in on them, or they're repelled by them. But they certainly have a high potential to alter how they use their landscapes. It can alter their reproductive timing. It can alter just many, many aspects of their population ecology. And so light is something that we really need to think about when we talk about how to better design facilities out in remote areas. And a certain kind of light, polarized light, is especially bad. A lot of human products, and often ones associated with energy products, energy facilities, imitate water. So they can be dark bodies, they can be oil spills, they can just be cars, they can be asphalt, they can be any of those things. Birds and insects often think they're water. And so they come in and they land on them and they get trapped by landing in the wrong place. So not good. And I think the estimate of moths that die in Las Vegas every year is like something up in the multiple millions from, coming in, the beam, the triangle beam. I forgot the name of that casino. But you can see it for miles and miles and miles in the Mojave, and the bugs are all coming in and dying in that beam. Another thing that really is new and that most people don't think about is that when we reduce vegetative cover by all sorts of means, it can be energy development and exploration, it can be creating oil pads. It can be creating all sorts of different things. If we blade the vegetation or if we run over the soil crust, we're basically making a dark surface light. Studies have shown that when you do that, you reduce the rainfall in the area where it has been lightened. And so this is a great slide out of Australia where they cleared the vegetation over here and suddenly found that they had a 10% increase in precipitation compared to the long-term average in the vegetated area and a 30% decrease in that now cleared area, which then leads to less vegetation, which then leads to less precipitation, which then leads to less vegetation. So you can really set up a negative feedback loop that you might not be so happy with. This can be really exacerbated when you have a huge solar farm because now you have a really reflective light surface. And I know that this has not really been entering into people's minds about, gee, maybe we don't want 250,000 acres of solar panels. Maybe we do want to break those up into more smaller facilities. Water consumption obviously is going to be a big issue. Solar panels need to get washed off a lot. You need to have water for oil and gas wells. You need tons of water for oil shale and tar sands. So it's really something that we need to think about and be smart about in terms of siting and in terms of sharing current infrastructure. You know, how do we actually minimize this consumption? What kind of technologies can we come up with to be a lot smarter about how we minimize the consumption? Part of the impacts of pumping that water and using it is we can actually kill off the plants that are stabilizing low areas, again enhancing dust production, and we just basically are left with a lot less for agriculture and other human needs and wildlife needs and plant needs and all the rest. So we all know that water in the West is a big issue. If we are really looking at an energy-full future, then we need to think very carefully about how we deal with water issues. Dust suppressants are going to be a biggie. Dust suppressants, especially for solar panels, they use a lot of dust suppressants along roads where they're pulling out oil and gas and, well, not gas, that's a pipeline, where they're pulling out the oil, they're pulling out the wastewater. Big trucks are going down dirt and gravel roads. You have a lot of dust suppressants. We know very little about the effects of dust suppressants on the surrounding vegetation or the waterways. And so we need to really get some information about this and start thinking maybe of ways that we can deal with dust perhaps in other ways than putting out a lot of dust suppressants. Spills and illegal dumping, obvious problems. There's lots of nasty things that come with solar farms, and of course oil and gas and other things. I mean, we know the list, so I'm not going to go through it. But certainly it's an issue. We know it's an issue. We've seen it in the past. We will continue to see it in the future unless we really take it seriously. Oil shale and tar sands have a little special problem that we don't see with most other things, and that's that they dig the place up. When you dig up soils, you basically create around 30% more than you can stuff back in the hole that you made. So you have this massive amount of overburden that you have to figure out what to do with. It's kind of like the coal mines, you know, when they take the tops off the mountains in the Appalachia, they've been throwing them in the washes and rivers right there because it expands. And so this is a really big issue in the West because we certainly don't want to be throwing the overburden into our washes and streams. Reclamation's hard enough, but we have this extra problem with this extraction because they really just basically strip mine it in a very similar way. So this is of special concern about what do we do with that big pile right there. And as I showed you before, we have a lot of oil shale in this area. Nuclear and coal gas plants, I think we're pretty familiar with the concerns. We've got the mining concerns of the coal or the uranium. We have to transport those materials, and so then you're looking at transportation roadways, you know, and all the impacts with that. The air pollution that comes out of the coal-fired power plants we're well familiar with. Water consumption is huge. Radioactive storage, you know, we've heard Yucca Mountain forever and ever and ever. And then reclamation, again, if these facilities are reclaimed. It's always going to be an issue in terms of what are we going to do if we decommission plants. Other impacts that couldn't find nice pictures for. Linear impacts, we heard about that. They often cross across western landscapes and cut off water supplies to downhill plants. This is a big issue if you're a downhill plant. Noise is a really big deal. Only a few decibels can alter the way the animals use their landscape. It can deafen them. It can make them want to burrow more deeply than temperatures are optimal. There's all sorts of problems with noise. Urbanization and suburbanization we heard about. This can be a major impact in terms of pets, ORV use, garbage. Garbage dumps brings ravens. Ravens eat baby desert tortoises. You know, I mean, it's really a tremendous number of downstream impacts with suburbanization and urbanization. And then soil compaction, I've blasted over, which everyone will be amazed if they know me, but it's a really big deal because we are out there compacting a tremendous amount of the landscape, both with development and exploration for energy sources. And you don't just go decompact a desert soil because you need water and freezing. It's a desert, and so you don't have much water, and you don't have that many freeze events, and so it takes a very long time. Dust on snow is the new thing that I wanted to talk to you briefly about because it's becoming a really major issue. All of these things I talked about produce dust. That dust gets deposited on the snowpack. When it gets deposited on the snowpack, here it's coming into Aspen, down from around the Four Corners area because it's red, so you know where it came from. You then have all sorts of impacts. This is a new phenomenon. We really didn't have much dust back in the BCs, but you got around 1850 when the settlement of the West started, and you see this huge increase in the amount of dust coming into the upstairs departments of the lakes in the high Rockies. Has all sorts of impacts on the way. It's got economic impacts downstairs from both machines getting clogged to people dying. And then the big kicker, though, is what goes on when it hits the snow. So basically, it darkens the snow surface, so it's going to melt faster because it's going to absorb more of the sun. Snow melts from underneath that layer of dust, and so they just collapse down. So all those dust events add up to be this darker and darker and darker layer, and the snow is melting faster and faster underneath it. And so you end up with much faster snow melting earlier in the season, so you have less late season water. And you then, because you've left the ground exposed, you have greater evaporation, so you have less water entering the streams and the rivers. And we had 2009, we had 50 days earlier snowmelt than normal. So it's huge, it's not trivial. When we modeled the impacts of that, we found that we had somewhere between 2 and 7% less annual input to the Colorado River. So this is huge. This is not like trivial at all. And the average was 5%. So if you think about that, 5% is 2 times Las Vegas's allocation, 18 months of LA, and half of what we owe Mexico, with our international treaty. So this is really big amounts of water that we're talking about. And all of these impacts, the transmission lines, the gas, the roads, the pipelines, the development themselves, the exploration, everything that we've been talking about is going to be feeding this problem of dust on snow. So this is becoming a bigger and bigger and bigger issue, especially as water supplies become more and more limited in the Colorado River. And it's already oversubscribed. Everybody knows that. We know that the future is bringing hotter and drier conditions. So we know that that water supply, even without dust, is going to be decreasing. But also, hotter and drier conditions mean that annualized areas with cheatgrass and halogeton and things like that, they don't germinate in drought years. Then you get a lot more dust, and so we're also looking at dustier and dustier years. So we're really in an amplification of the conditions that cause dust on snow. And so the picture's not pretty unless we can figure out some way to manage our activities downstairs to help reduce that dust. So I would suggest that there are many ways to reduce these impacts, but I think willpower is probably our biggest problem. And I should have put across the top design, design our landscapes. We really need to design. And I don't need to go through the list, but basically, because you heard it from Paul, you heard it from Bob, we just need to really think about what we're doing, minimize our impacts, share our infrastructure, use already disturbed lands. Why are we disturbing new landscapes? It's crazy. And yet we're doing it. And so I think that there's a lot of things that we can actually do. So I wanted to end with a reading from Wallace Stegner, because it's just so right on. And this is out of Where the Blackbird Sings to the Lemonade Springs, Living and Writing in the West. So, quote, "Once I said in print that the remaining Western wilderness is the geography of hope, and I have written, believing what I wrote, that the West at large is hope's native home, the youngest and freshest of America's regions, magnificently endowed and with the chance to become something unprecedented and unmatched in the world. I was shaped by the West and have lived most of my long life in it, and nothing would gratify me more than to see it, in all of its subregions and subcultures, both prosperous and environmentally healthy, with a civilization to match its scenery. But when I am thinking instead of throbbing, I remember what history and experience has taught me about the West's past, and what my senses tell me about the West's present, and I become more cautious about the West's future. Too often when they have been prosperous, the Western states have been prosperous at the expense of their fragile environment, and their civilization has too often mined and degraded the natural scene while drawing most of its quality from it. So I mend my enthusiasm. I begin to quibble and qualify. I say, yes, the West is hope's native home, but there are varieties and degrees of hope, and the wrong kinds. In excessive amounts go with human failure and environmental damage, as boom goes with bust." So I would leave us with that cautionary tale. I don't think it has to be true. I'm an optimist to the max. But I also think that we do have a history where we don't pay attention. We keep kind of doing la, 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 thinking everything is going to be okay. But I echo the pleas of the previous two speakers that we get together, that we work together, that the agencies work hand in hand with the private landowners, and that we design our future, not just bumble into it. Thanks.
Questions?
In your position, how do you twist the arms to make things happen the way we'd like to see it?
You mean as a USGS scientist?
Yes, like how do you make...
Oh, I talk all the time. Really, honestly, I have a lot of data, but mostly I think it's not data anymore. I used to always think all I had to do was show people, you know, that the data showed this or that. I think we're now in a time where it's the cultural context, it's the social context. It's like Paul said, it's listening to people's viewpoint and not thinking you're right. And it's amazing how people can really come together, but the science needs to be the underpinning of it, but it's not the answer for it. Does that make sense? And so, you know, it's really bringing everyone together around the science, but not pretending for a second that the science is going to be the ultimate answer, because it's not. And it doesn't bring in that social reality and the economic reality that we really need to pay attention to. And that's where science can be really blind, because the West is going to be a major source of energy. It's not going to be. And so that's where we need to start paying attention to that piece too. The question is whether or not we really are, well, have the agencies and other people really taken advantage of the new technologies that can reduce footprints? Is that a good summation? I can't speak for the land management agencies. Luckily, I just get to do the science and say, hey guys, here's the consequences of that action and here's the consequences of this action. I do see a lot of incredibly well-intentioned want to get things done in a different way, people being stymied by the policies. I also see the flip side. I see other people taking advantage of the policies to impose the old ways. So, you know, I can't answer how much an agency is moving forward. There's lots of agency people here who can probably help. But there are ways, and there's tons of ways. Sharing roads, sharing pipeline corridors. Maybe you don't share the pipeline, but sharing that corridor. This whole idea of directional drilling has been just a godsend in terms of the number of paths that are needed. But also, as was commented on the previous talks, I don't see much emphasis on reclamation to the degree we could do. And so in reducing the footprint, we also need to look at the past and say, okay, how could we fix what we already did? And there's tons we could do that we don't do. And there's tons of areas out there that could be reclaimed that aren't. They're halogeton and cheatgrass. And so I also think that there's a lot to do looking back. There's tons we can do looking forward, but we need someone from a land management agency to help us with whether there's any more forward-looking policies on the books, because I don't know. So the question is, how do we, that as we go through life, that the new generations are starting out with a more degraded landscape than was before, and how do we keep that from framing what we go forward with? I would remind everybody here, because most of you don't know, that Utah was mostly a grassland when the pioneers got here, and it was rapidly converted into sagebrush, and it was mostly by cattle. Most people don't know that, but if you look in the pioneer journals, this was very much a grassland state. Certainly the Salt Lake Valley did not look like it did, and Utah Lake, the swamps around there were pretty much drained, and it was made, you know, a dry shrubland. Very different than what we think, and we sort of think, you know, it was always like it was, and that's very typical of every generation to move forward from where you are. And I think it's absolutely essential that we keep that in mind and roll back that vision of what was cannot necessarily be again, but to keep it in mind as an alternative future. Now, climate change is really going to affect our ability to get where we want to go, but we can take that into consideration too. But I do think that we are not only in the line of design, in the head of designer landscapes for energy, but designer landscapes in terms of vegetation. We need to decide what we're going to manage for, because we're not necessarily going to be able to have what we had. But that doesn't mean that we accept what we would think of as a degraded state. And I would just fall back on process. What we need to do is conserve the potential of landscapes in terms of their processes, their nitrogen cycling, their soil erosion, you know, things like that, where we can go back and keep the potential of that landscape so we can do with it where we would like to see it go. But you're really right, and it's something that we need to think of all the time, is not what did you grow up with, but what could you have grown up with, and where do we go forward from that? And we have a lot of relic areas around Utah that we can go and see, and the nice thing there is it takes into account climate change, and we can say, okay, you know, here's a potential landscape we could have if we made certain social decisions. And so I've been using those in Southeast Utah, for example, as our, not management goals, but again, just of a, here's an alternative that's possible. Here's an alternative that we've got now that's possible. You know, here's where we could go if we continue the activities like we have, possibility. And so it gives us a nice range, but very important point.
Let's give Jayne a big hand.
See.
I switched sides on you.